Look familiar? It may resemble Europe in the 1930s, but the place is not Nazi Germany, but Illinois, near Chicago in the 1970s. Well, not exactly Nazis, but actually neo-Nazis. That is, a small, extreme fringe group of Americans intent on stirring up bigotries with hateful messages.
The final solution to the Jewish question is exposing them as the leaders of international communism and race mixing.
Hello, I'm Aaron Freeman, here in Skokie, Illinois, in front of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. I grew up in Chicago, not far from here, and now live in Chicago's northern suburbs, the North Shore. So why is this major Holocaust museum located here in Skokie, of all places? In 1977, Skokie was confronted by a small group of neo-Nazis who applied for a permit to march here. This unleashed a torrent of fear and anxiety in a community traumatized by memories of Nazi horrors during World War II. It was a serious situation filled with irony and absurdity. These Nazis never numbered more than 20 or 30 individuals. They were perhaps more accurately Nazi wannabes. That is, white Americans harboring extreme racism and anti-Semitism. Now, no one wants Nazis marching in their backyard, but this was especially true here because Skokie's population included upwards of 7,000 survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, a larger percentage of survivors than in any other town in America.
When people heard about the fact that a group of neo-Nazis, so-called neo-Nazis, would march in Skokie, they thought it was some kind of charade, some kind of put-on joke.
The storm troops march with firm, determined pace.
It may have been easy to mistake this group as a ragtag band of buffoons, to be dismissed and ignored, not to be given undue attention. But despite their small numbers, the symbolism loomed large in how they dressed and what they represented. Of course, these kinds of memories don't fade away easily or ever.
I was a child when all of this happened to me, and just to see a Nazi flag drove me crazy. I lost my parents, I lost my brothers, my sisters, my aunts and uncles, and to see a Nazi flag just awakened all of these terrible things.
Collins and his group wearing the Nazi swastika, armbands, boots, Sam Brown belts, those meant one thing and one thing only to the people who lived in Skokie, who were in the 7,000 survivors who lived here, and that was death.
Skokie began as Niles Center, ironically a German-dominated center of agriculture and marketing. German immigrants began populating the town in the 1850s, and German was commonly spoken. Yes, that is a youth march led by a swastika flag in Soldier Field circa 1936. My, how times have changed at the home of the Chicago Bears. The German-American Bund was a prominent organization with members occasionally seen around Skokie and other areas in their Nazi uniforms. When America entered into World War II in 1941, the local Nazis disappeared. Skokie appealed to Jews with its affordable homes close to Chicago. Population 70,000, 40,000 of whom were Jewish. The largest Jewish population per capita in the United States. The large influx of Jews and Holocaust survivors relocated to Skokie for its safety and sense of community, establishing synagogues, Jewish centers, delis, and all the trappings of Jewish life.
Skokie has been described as the gateway to the North Shore. And it's better housing, better schools, better opportunities. It represented for many people in Chicago the American dream.
A few Jewish people came to Skokie. And when you come from Europe, you want to go someplace where there's a friend, a neighbor, and so it attracted more and more, and that grew until it became like another home.
Essentially, there was almost a kind of great migration that happened among Jews who lived in Chicago coming to Skokie.
It was, of course, no coincidence that these Nazis wanted to march in Skokie. Skokie had a special significance, a community where many people experienced firsthand the evil these symbols represented.
Now I know that my dad survived several concentration camps, death marches, and my mother spent 3 years as a child running and hiding in easternmost Poland. She told me almost nothing about that. It took me years until I discovered it. And this, I've learned, has been pretty much the norm of families in Skokie and even families of Holocaust survivors everywhere.
The marches occurred and the Nazis took my parents and my family into cattle cars where they were destroyed in Sobibor. And I was an orphan, and my older sister, Rosa, who was about 15, 17 years older than I, took charge and saved me.
Images emblazoned on the memories of survivors, suffering beyond comprehension, a time and place never to be forgotten, scenes that could awaken memories of a not-so-distant past. Many Skokie residents had strong connections to these scenes, often with permanent reminders of the horrors lived through.
My experiences as a child go back to, I was born in a small town in Poland called Skokie Podlaski. I had two sisters, one older and my baby sister, Sarah, who went to her death in a place called Treblinka at age 6. My dad went to Treblinka. My poor little sister went to Treblinka. And I have this horrific thought about her death in Treblinka, being chased into a large sorting room where her clothes were taken away and her black pigtails shorn from her head on the pretense of taking a shower. And this is what you carry with you. That scene never goes away.
I was in 5, 6 camps and I was almost dead. We were working in coal mines and they kept you only because they needed the work. There is other reason. I had my younger brother with me and he got sick and they shot him because he couldn't go out to work after 3 days.
It was no fluke that these people survived the horrors that they were faced with. Their savvy and strength of character were to be reckoned with and made the difference between life and death.
The survivors really, I can't say it any other way, they came out of the woodwork. They were not going to let this happen again. And this is saying, never again, became their rallying cry.
Being a Nazi is certainly not something most sane people aspire to. Nazi leader Frank Collin, or more accurately, leader of the NSPA, the National Socialist Party of America, a lofty name for such a small band of misfits. Collin espoused the well-known hatreds associated with Nazis, only tailored to white American racists, anti-black and anti-Semitic being the familiar themes. And remember, just 20 or 30 members of Collin's group. That's a small number, causing a whole heap of trouble. The irony is that there are now strict laws banning the existence of Nazi organizations and their symbols in Germany and other countries.
Germany itself stops them. Germany itself, by law, they could have never marched this way through a Jewish section in Berlin or Frankfurt or anywhere else.
Yes, they should be outlawed the same way like they are outlawed in Russia, in Poland, in Romania, in Czechoslovakia.
Beginning in September 1976, tens of thousands of flyers began appearing around the northern suburbs of Chicago, reading, "We are coming." Threatening phone calls were also received.
I remember a Friday night service, I think it was October of 1976, where someone came back from the parking lot with a leaflet saying that the Nazis are coming. All I know is that after that incident, the matter seemed to catch fire amongst people who were Holocaust survivors.
My dad was going nuts about this. When it would come on TV and it was a media phenomenon at the time, my dad would turn pale, ashen pale, and the relatives would be calling each other on the phone, calling each other on the phone. The Nazis are coming back, they're coming again.
Strangely, Collin is said to be half Jewish. His father's original name was Max Simon Cohen, a Jew who was himself imprisoned at the Dachau concentration camp. Max and other family members disapproved highly of Frank's Nazi activities.
Frank Collin had a Jewish father, Max Cohen, who I knew. And poor Max Cohen. Very, very sad. I talked to him a few times and he would put his head down like this when he would talk about his Nazi kid.
You have nothing to do with Mr. Frank Collins' organization. He is a splinter organization that was founded in 1970 when he was expelled from this party because of the fact that his father was a Jew.
You gotta be kidding. The head Nazi's father was Jewish and a prisoner at Dachau. Even his Nazi brethren can't stomach that. Clearly, Colin was an unlikely Nazi, half Jewish and hardly an imposing figure, though donning this kind of getup would change all that. Chicago newspaper columnist Mike Royko called Colin the dippy Nazi and a warped twerp. He even seemed to favor a Hitler-like hairstyle, and just that look on his face. What kind of a Nazi is this happy? Many laid into Colin as a joke and a fraud. In the Blues Brothers movie, the Blues Brothers, played by John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, were at odds with a Colin-like character played by actor Henry Gibson.
White men, white women, the swastika is calling you. The Jew is using the black as muscle against you.
John Landis directed the Blues Brothers movie and wrote the script together with Dan Aykroyd. That is, except for the speech delivered by Gibson.
He gives this speech, white men, white women. That speech, I actually took word for word. It was the answer, the machine, the answering message that when you called the American Nazi Party, that was the message you got. And at the end it said, please leave a message when you hear the beep. What I did, what is kind of amusing or not, is I did leave a message. I said, hi, my name's John Landis and I'm doing a movie, and they never called me back.
Illinois Nazis. I hate Illinois Nazis.
America would be nothing without the white people, and the white people would be nothing without America.
But reality was stranger than fiction, and nothing seemed to faze Colin. The exposure merely egged him on. And did I mention just 20-some-odd Nazis caused all this? Chicago had a reputation as the North's most segregated city. In 1966, American Nazi Party leader George Lincoln Rockwell showed up and marched against Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who was protesting the lack of housing for blacks. Colin was a member of Rockwell's National Socialist White People's Party of America. Rockwell was assassinated in 1967 by a disgruntled member of his own party. Colin then broke away in 1968 and formed the NSPA. The small NSPA headquarters was called Rockwell Hall in the Southside neighborhood of Marquette Park, predominantly white and a racial tinderbox, and Colin wanted it to remain that way. And it was no mistake that the NSPA had their small offices here, where they had a modest base of support.
I hate niggers.
I hate Jews and I hate niggers, and I want to live in my own white neighborhood by myself, and I don't care how much money a nigger makes. He can make it more than I do, but I just don't want to live by it. You understand that?
I understand. I understand that this is one racist and perhaps deranged lady, and I wouldn't want to live by you either. Chicago blacks and supporters protested racism in Marquette Park. Colin made his first mark by confronting blacks as they marched against racism. These often were not peaceful demonstrations, as white teenagers threw bricks and dozens were injured and arrested. Marches also took place in Berwyn and other areas. Buzz Alpert was a Chicago leader of the Jewish Defense League, or JDL, and had more than his share of confrontations with Colin and his Nazis.
We became aware of Nazi demonstrations. They would come out in full Nazi uniforms, jack boots, brown pants, the swastikas. In Berwyn, horrendous fight started. And I remember, because I nearly got killed that day, I remember I had a Nazi, a big husky Nazi on the ground with two fingers in his eyes.
Yes, that's Buzz engaged in his favorite extracurricular sporting activity, Nazi bashing, circa 1972. And Colin was sometimes the recipient of knuckle sandwiches, but usually relished the attention and was happy to show some blood for the cameras.
Is the memory of the millions of people who died in the Holocaust served by this kind of watch me punch him in the nose attitude?
Well, I'll tell you what. I know for a fact that if we went to Europe and we raised the souls of all the dead who died at the hands of the Nazis, Jewish, Gentile, black, white, whatever the hell they are, and we said to them, this time we'll give you a chance, will you resist? The answer, I'm sure, would be yes.
The Nazis continued to focus on Market Park and nearby areas until the city of Chicago resurrected a liability insurance requirement of $250,000 to be posted, prohibitive to the NSPA. This should have essentially muzzled the Nazis, but Colin proved adept at changing tactics to his advantage.
It seemed to be that's when Frank Collin decided, oh, I got fertile ground up north where it's not the blacks, it's the Jews live, the survivors of the Holocaust. Let me go up there.
Collin sent a letter to about 12 North Shore communities requesting a permit to march in a Skokie Park on November 6, 1976. It was signed, respectfully, Frank Collin. Perhaps respectfully was not the best word to use in this case.
The reason Skokie responded was because it had become a legal issue. And there was some division within the village government. There were some within the village government who believed that the best advisable course was let them march, get it over with, give a minimum publicity and move on.
It was my opinion that the best thing the village could do would be to grant a permit to Colin and let him appear, which then was only intended as a 5-minute step onto a platform and off, and out he would go.
We were advised that we should cool it, we should put down the shades, and we should forget about it. We couldn't take that. We didn't take that for an answer.
Colin could never have anticipated the coup he stumbled into when Skokie responded to his request. He now knew that Skokie was the perfect target for his venom and took advantage of the system to further his agenda. The First Amendment paved the Nazis' path to Skokie with assistance from the bedrock U.S. legal system, protecting freedom of speech no matter how disturbing the content may be. The sequence of events wouldn't end until reaching the U.S. Supreme Court. While the Nazis didn't exactly appear to be playing with a full deck, they did know how to grab attention and use the system to their advantage. Organizations including the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Jewish Federation of Chicago all backed this quarantine strategy. That is, allowing the march but ignoring the Nazis. Of course, ignoring the Nazis would have been hard to accomplish given the fascination by the local and national news media.
Do you fully appreciate the anguish that you create with your presence, especially for those who have tattoos on their arm, those who lost? You're smiling in sort of almost a kind of...
Waiting for the chance to reply.
Yeah, but my question should not provoke a smile in you, Mr. Collins.
Not only do I appreciate it, I calculated upon it. I use the hysteria of the Jewish community in Skokie especially to propel the issue of First Amendment rights for National Socialists and for people who speak up for the white people.
A man who heads the so-called National Socialist Party of America, which has as its ultimate purpose the incinerating of blacks and Jews. Now, I would argue that persons such as that should not be scheduled.
What is your point? I have a right to put him on, but I shouldn't?
Yes, I thought it was poor judgment.
Survivors like the late Erna Gans strongly protested the quarantine approach. Gans was a survivor who lost most of her family and said she wasn't going to let that happen again.
I lost my parents, I lost my brothers, I lost my family, I went through hell, I came to the United States, was active in various organizations, raised my family, belief in everything, and so on, and all of a sudden I'm confronted with them, they saying 6 million more, and that they didn't kill enough. And we are forgetting that they did kill 6 million Jews, but they killed 6 million non-Jews. And this is not a Jewish question, and this is not a Holocaust survivors question. This is a human question.
She took charge as leader of an organization of survivors not willing to accept Nazis in Skokie. Under intense pressure from survivors, the ADL and other organizations relented, agreeing instead to take all measures to keep the Nazi group out. The late Saul Goldstein also took a lead within the survivor community. In Lithuania, Nazis murdered his mother and also his 2-year-old daughter.
The way he told the story is a 2-year-old tripped, and he watched as the guards killed her. I get emotional. When he was telling me this, my daughter had just turned 2, so I could picture it. He showed us still the markings on his chest of running against the barbed wire trying to get to save his kid. How do you let that happen again?
We ran into a stone wall of resistance led by Saul Goldstein in particular and the Holocaust survivor group.
In the 1981 CBS television movie Skokie, Danny Kaye portrayed a survivor.
If you want no violence, keep the Nazis out! Because if they march here, if they bring the swastika here, I swear to you, nothing, there is nothing will keep me from fighting them.
There was great debate both locally and nationally as to the proper course of action and how much attention to pay to the Nazis.
I value the rights in this country very much, and I would hesitate to deny them to any other citizen.
The Jews are very, very upset about this situation because the Nazis advocate genocide. They want to eliminate the Jewish people, period. Right. Of course, we should be resentful and angry.
Survivors began opening up. Images reawakened unspeakable horrors. Those who had repressed their memories came out into the open and would not be silent.
The rabbis, they said, be quiet, don't do anything, just sit back and watch and let them go through and it will go over. So we said, no, this is how it started in Germany with a few people only. We're not going to let nobody here, we are, since we're in the United States and we're not afraid, nobody's going to come to our door and tell me that he's going to kill me.
Many survivors never spoke until now of the atrocities they witnessed. They often suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This was years before the condition was officially recognized as an illness.
Post-traumatic stress was not something that we were familiar with. We all carried baggage. I came here with a feeling of inferiority. I came here with the feeling that I would never be able to succeed in life. Nightmares haunted me for years.
It was at that time that for the first time that I started to speak about the Holocaust. Before, no one ever knew, really, most people did not know that I was a survivor.
Whenever we get together, we all talk about it. No matter how happy we are at a party or whatever, at the end we wind up talking about camps, about our experiences during the war.
They used to take our young women pregnant, knock them down on the streets, kick them in their stomach till they bear their kids. Many dreams now lately, and I wake up and I'm just out of myself. I can't go back to sleep and I don't know what to do. You know, I'm just hysterical.
In Europe, the Jews underestimated the Nazis and the destruction they would bring. That would not happen this time. Instead, the attitude was to be strong, vigilant, and preemptive against trouble before it happened.
When you realize that you have people in uniform wearing a swastika coming down your street, you have to make some changes in your attitude.
They weren't scared of these Nazis and were willing, if necessary, to use confrontation and violence against them.
And for me, I got a gun.
In Nazi Germany, there was no justice or day in court for Jews, but the Nazi criminals were afforded all kinds of rights in Germany and now in the US. It all boiled down to whether Collins' group was within their rights to demonstrate. despite the potential of provoking violence. The neo-Nazi provocation unleashed a perfect storm that attracted all kinds of participants and not always in unison. And the strangest twist? Jewish lawyers throwing a lifeline to the Nazis' fledgling campaign to demonstrate. The plot thickened when the American Civil Liberties Union agreed to enter the case, representing the Nazis. Yes, that's right. The ACLU was defending the rights of Nazis who, given the chance, would exterminate their Jewish lawyers. Is there anything wrong with this picture?
The ACLU has, to my mind, the finest legal brains in the country. I think Mr. Goldberger is a sincere man. I think he is probably well, at the risk of offending all my other lawyers, he's probably the only honest lawyer I've ever really met.
So how does one handle compliments from a Nazi?
Colin was a model client because within the context of the controversy, he was candid about what his plans were, what he was doing, and he was accessible, and he would take an attorney's advice as to what the best way to proceed was in terms of accomplishing his goals.
David Hamlin was executive director of the ACLU at the time.
It was, in fact, a Jewish lawyer defending the First Amendment rights of an individual in an organization who would have gone straight after that Jewish lawyer had they gained any power at all. We were constantly aware of the kind of strange dichotomy that presented.
I thought there would be very little likelihood that we would lose because all of the kinds of speech activities that Frank Collin wanted to engage in with his National Socialist Party of America were classic kinds of protest activities in public places.
Now, this wasn't out of the ordinary for the ACLU, staunchly advocating for clients in First Amendment cases for many years. In some cases, it was the oppressed they represented, and other times the oppressor. And they took pains to make clear they didn't always support their clients' views.
Some folks seemed to believe that somehow because we were defending their right to speak, we therefore supported what they were saying. That was never the case, of course. Indeed, their approach was antithetical to what ACLU stands for.
Goldberger took much of the brunt of the ACLU backlash, often personally singled out as the villain.
I had kind of assumed, and maybe I was naive, that if there was ever going to be any violence, it was going to be directed at me. I could understand the Jewish radicals wanting to take me out. I'm a Jew. I was fully confident that no one that would want to hurt me would want to hurt my family. So that I really wasn't worried for the family. I was worried that some windows might have been broken in the house, which didn't happen. But I was nervous, but I said if they can frighten me out of this, then there's no First Amendment.
David Goldberger, I openly admit that I tried desperately to find him. And I am not ashamed to admit that I knocked his head off if I ever could have gotten close to him.
I've had a problem with organizations like the ACLU, although they do the right thing, but it becomes personal. You know, having a Jew defend somebody, a Nazi that's trying to stick you into a goddamn crematoria, you know, and kill you. There's also a counter to this. You can't holler fire in a crowded theater.
The internal debate within the ACLU became fierce, and it affected them where it hurts most, the pocketbook. Nationally, 15% or 30,000 members resigned, and financial support dropped a whopping $500,000 a year. The Illinois office lost 30% of its income in 1977 and had to lay off 5 of the office's 13 employees.
We did take a serious hit, and while it almost all came back over the 2 or 3 years after Skokie finally concluded, the stress and the tension of what we were going through at the time was very real and quite painful.
Nevertheless, the ACLU held firm and never wavered in its resolve to continue with the case.
There was never any discussion about abandoning the suits we had brought, about changing our position, about backing off in any way.
Survivors and others implored that the Nazis be banned from marching. Skokie Mayor Albert Smith took a leading role in trying to keep the community on the same page, but this didn't go smoothly. Although not Jewish himself, Smith was sensitive to his community and the troubles facing it.
I think Al Smith did the right thing. Given the time and the situation, the village of Skokie had the largest number of Holocaust survivors of any municipality in the world outside of Israel. And Mayor Smith understood what the tensions were within the Jewish community.
Meanwhile, the Nazi group announced their intention to hold a demonstration in uniform on the steps of the Skokie Village Hall on May 1st, 1977. The Nazis' own propaganda publications heralded what they perceived as their fight against the Jews and communists. Keeping score became quite challenging when it came to Skokie. Injunctions, rulings, appeals, suits, and countersuits would become common vernacular. Skokie files an injunction barring the Nazis from demonstrating. Let's try to keep track and chalk them up as we go. The next day, Cook County Circuit Court Judge Joseph Wozik issued a preliminary injunction prohibiting Collins' group from marching in Skokie. Collin countered by planning to march the day before, on April 30th. A sly move, but one that wouldn't go unnoticed. But Judge Harold Sullivan responded by expanding the injunction.
We needed to do something legally. And so we, members of my staff, went over to a judge who lived in Skokie, happened to be a Roman Catholic, Harold Sullivan, obtained an injunction from him covering not only April 30th, but any time into the future.
This happened as Collin was en route to demonstrate. He was promptly intercepted by the Skokie police and turned back to where he came from.
But as of 10:52 this morning, Judge Sullivan expanded the injunction, forbidding you from parading in the village of Skokie on the 30th of April and thereafter, until further notice of the court.
Next, the Skokie Village Board ramped up its defenses by going on the offense. 3 ordinances were quickly enacted. Ordinance 994 required an insurance bond of $350,000 and stated demonstration permits would not be issued to applicants portraying criminality, depravity, racial hatred, and other hostilities. Ordinance 995 banned the distribution of literature promoting racial hatred. Ordinance 996 prohibited demonstrations by individuals wearing military-style uniforms. Skokie's strategy is that defending the ordinances will eat up a lot of time, even if they don't stand up in court.
The village board adopted 3 ordinances which we hoped would bolster our case. They subsequently became the basis for the federal court suit brought by the ACLU against the village.
In response, the ACLU blasted the ordinances, filing Collin versus Smith, with David Goldberger representing Frank Collin against Skokie and Mayor Albert Smith. Goldberger went on to represent Collin in all his cases. Saul Goldstein files his own lawsuit via the case of Goldstein versus Collin. It's a class action representing survivors claiming deliberate infliction of severe mental and emotional distress. The Illinois Supreme Court enters the fray, denying the ACLU appeal of the appellate court refusal to stay the injunction against the march. In the case NSPA v. Skokie, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Illinois courts must lift the injunction or hear an argument on the merits. There were now 3 separate legal approaches being pursued from different angles. Skokie had to believe that by throwing enough barriers against the wall, something would stick. Or would it? So if you're not confused yet, just hang around. I'm trying to keep up myself. Colin applies for a permit to demonstrate in front of the Skokie Village Hall on July 4th. Skokie denies Colin's request for a permit to march in military-style uniforms in Skokie. Colin then announced the NSPA would cancel its July 4th Skokie demonstration pending a court decision. By now, the Jewish Defense League had jumped in full force, adopting a zero-tolerance strategy to confront the Nazis head-on. Firebrand founder Rabbi Meir Kahane came to Skokie speaking on July 4th, 1977, mincing no words on how to handle the neo-Nazis.
Rights? They have rights? What person has rights? The right to try to persuade other people to put me into an oven. What person has the right to demand freedom to end my freedom? We spit in the graves of 6 million Jews if we allow the Nazis to march. We are Jews! We couldn't be prouder! We can't
The JDL promised strength in numbers and also came dressed and prepared for violence.
Kahane came back to Chicago and came to me and asked me to come out of hiding, so to speak. I mean, I was running the JDL anyway. And he came back and said, Buzz, step up. Of course, I told him I already stepped up.
Many things have happened in Chicago, most of all the Nazis and their growth. When we were active here in Chicago, the Nazis had 9 members in uniform and a few out of uniform. The last time they came up north, and we trailed them. We had surveillance on them. They had 24 in uniform and 11 out. And others within the crowd that did not come up with them. The fact that the Nazis are a threat is a real thing.
I don't know if we should even mention this. I'm a trap and skeet shooter. I threw my shotgun in the car and I wanted to get where the demonstrations were. You couldn't get anywhere near it because the police had it cordoned off and things like that.
Kill Nazis now! Kill Nazis now!
I had already heard very early on that as they were announcing the routes, there were groups, probably the Jewish Defense League, who were renting apartments for the day on the route. And it was not to watch the parade, it was to take action. And I got some very good information that they had the rifles and they were ready to take them out.
The Illinois State Appellate Court upholds the injunction against the march granted in April by Judge Wozek. Ever the staunch defender, the ACLU appeals to the Illinois Supreme Court to allow the display of the swastikas by the Nazis. Skokie is halted from enforcing the 3 ordinances via a preliminary injunction issued by Judge Bernard Decker of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. The Illinois Supreme Court strikes down the entire injunction, allowing the Nazis to march in Skokie pending resolution of a federal lawsuit filed by the ACLU on behalf of the NSPA. The ruling said that neither the march nor the swastika could be banned. The Illinois Supreme Court also dismisses the ADL suit, ruling against Saul Goldstein in the appeal of Goldstein v. Collin. The U.S. Supreme Court declines to hear the appeal, effectively sidelining the Goldstein case. U.S. District Court Judge Bernard Decker strikes down the 3 ordinances as a violation of the First Amendment. Collin's next targeted march date is April 20th, Hitler's birthday. He later changes the date to April 22nd, the first day of Passover. The man has a knack for picking momentous dates on his calendar. The community geared up and was ready to face any appearance by the Nazis on the village hall steps. This was put on hold when Judge Decker called a timeout on the April 20th date, granting a stay to allow the Court of Appeals time to hear an appeal. As the legal battles mounted, cooperation between different religions included an interfaith service bringing together diverse clergy and their congregants. A wide swath of religious and ethnic groups from the area, as well as from across the country and abroad, came out in support of Skokie. Cooperation between community leaders, politicians, and other unforeseen supporters together in the same room could be seen. Unlikely allies emerged along the way, identifying with Skokie's plight and seeing commonality as targets of prejudice.
This morning, I voiced some concern about the Nazis' march into Skokie, or the Klans marching on blacks in Mississippi. Number one, growing racial polarization is a threat to the nation, a threat to domestic tranquility.
The Illinois legislature got into the act, introducing resolutions and bills that would criminalize public displays of racial hatred.
I introduced it. We had hearings in the Senate. With new legislation, you could again stop it. Would it last forever? Most of us probably doubted it. But it would get it beyond that date, and then we'd keep working on it.
But the bills didn't make it past the Illinois Senate and were later voted down by the Illinois House. Rulings and counter-rulings, delays, injunctions, reversals, you name it. And the Nazis, keeping up with their permit requests, now targeted a new march date of June 25th. The U.S. Court of Appeals affirms Judge Decker's ruling that the three ordinances are unconstitutional. The Illinois Supreme Court is instructed to stop any further delay. Then a surprising turn of events. Collin announces he'll drop the Skokie March if Chicago gives him permission to march in Marquette Park. A final appeal by Skokie to the U.S. Supreme Court is rebuffed, as the First Amendment rights of Collin and his National Socialist Party are upheld. Skokie planned to put its entire 140-member police force on duty for the anticipated day, plus other outside officers, state troopers, and National Guard to keep the peace.
The system had a whole set of laws proposed to ban us, take away our symbols, ban our uniform, our literature, our assembly, everything. And by threatening to go into Skokie, at the same time exercising our rights within the law, we were able to break the system down, back the system down. They threw away those proposed ordinances and legislation, and the party is now on firm legal ground.
But alas, after all the threats, lawsuits, tension, and nerve-wracking, the Nazis never set foot here on the steps of Skokie Village Hall. On June 22, 1978, District Court Judge George Layton overturned Chicago's parade insurance requirement. The city of Chicago relents, permitting the group to march in Marquette Park on July 9th. Letters of support poured in, and many promised to counter-demonstrate. Nevertheless, counter-demonstrators promised to make their presence known in Marquette Park as well.
I'm here today representing Californians. We came to this community for a number of reasons. Overall, because we care, we are good Americans, we are concerned about what's happening in this country, we are concerned about what may happen July 9th in Marquette Park, and I can tell all of you that on July 9th at the Nazis' march in Marquette Park, hundreds of Californians will be here in Chicago.
Collin confirms that the NSPA won't march in Skokie after all, no doubt motivated by the prospect of 50,000 counter-demonstrators seeking to drown out him and his few followers.
He publicly announces calling off the march and that he's got a permit, which we had worked out already with the city, to march at another time in Marquette Park. And that's what stopped it.
The location for the Nazi march was instead changed to the Federal Plaza in downtown Chicago, a location offered by the Justice Department's Community Relations Service. Counter-protesters were ready and out in force.
The police felt that they could have better control in an open plaza, in the Federal Plaza, as far as those snipers up in the windows, and the building was a federal building, and around there, post office was right there. So they felt that the essence of protection would be better there.
National Socialism, all it is a surviving of a species of people.
Right to their own opinion ends when it's a slap in my face.
Out, out, kick them out, kick the stinking Nazis out.
Jewish blood will be avenged.
They had a march in front of the City Hall in Chicago, downtown. My husband went down there. When he came back, he was so hoarse, he couldn't open up his mouth to say a word.
On July 9, 1978, there was a second march in Marquette Park. Not exactly a record turnout, with just 12 NSPA members showing up to demonstrate. On the other side were 2,000 anti-Nazi counter-protesters. It was a circus-like atmosphere, with the police maintaining a wide buffer zone, essentially isolating the Nazis.
They have millions and millions of dollars to protect 12 crazy Nazis.
Throw me in jail, too. Right bunch of pigs.
They were standing and shouting at us just like the Nazis in Germany. And we walked there, we were protected from the police, and we got into the park. We couldn't get very close to them.
I got arrested in Marquette Park. They were going to throw me in a cell with a Nazi that they had also arrested. Until I informed them, I said, look, I know you don't give a damn about me, but you're going to get writer's cramp if you put me in there, because I'm going to kill him. You know, if he doesn't kill me first.
Thousands of counter-demonstrators from across the country converged, together with television crews from around the world. Colin was met by a barrage of eggs, beer cans, and rocks, and only stayed for about 10 or 15 minutes before exiting as he came, via police escort. The end result was that despite a legal victory by the neo-Nazis, Skokie prevailed in keeping them out of their community. Colin says he never really wanted to march in Skokie, though he got way more than his 15 minutes of fame, appearing on television and in print for a year. But he ultimately wasn't ready for prime time, or the wrath he would have faced in Skokie. If there was any doubt as to Colin's intentions, he made his thinking clear after the Skokie controversy passed.
The type of man that I'm trying to get now is a fanatic. I want people in the party who are willing to die for the movement, even though they may not even be sure we're going to win tomorrow. If you're not willing to kill, if you're not willing to shoot somebody for your ideals, you don't really believe in it.
Within a year of Skokie, Colin was ousted as leader of the NSPA. A year later, Colin was convicted of child molestation. He served 3 years of a 7-year sentence. Colin, a child molester? Now this is stranger than fiction. Now, for those of you who believe these events were much ado about nothing, that Colin yanked our chains and somehow scored a victory, think again. In 1987, a monument to the victims of the Holocaust was unveiled between the Skokie Library and Village Hall. The sculpture depicts a freedom fighter, a youth clinging to his grandfather, and a mother with her dead child. On the night of the dedication, the monument was desecrated with swastikas, a grim reminder that hatred remains and won't die out easily. Illinois became the first state to legislate Holocaust education be taught in public schools.
We recognized a lot because of what happened in Skokie with the potential march, the need for Holocaust education in our schools in Illinois. And we were the first in the nation to pass mandatory Holocaust education.
The Skokie events led Holocaust survivors to form the Holocaust Memorial Foundation of Illinois in 1981. A small Holocaust exhibit emerged, leading to the opening in 2009 of the new Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. The monumental structure was built to remember those who were murdered and to educate against hatred and prejudice.
We felt it was very important to maintain the linkage because it was born here. This organization was born here in Skokie. It was the major place where survivors came, more than any place in the country.
Inside, a small area recounts the turmoil that gave birth to the structure, a reminder of the good that arose from evil. The opening day demonstrated that hatred is still rampant and never very far away.
Amidst that joy and delight at the museum's opening was a small speck, a reminder really, of the kind of hate and intolerance and anti-Semitism that first led to our very creation. Off on the margins, in a designated protest area, was a neo-Nazi group dressed in all of their indicia of hate that gathered to protest and demonstrate.
In retrospect, there were a couple of key moves that may have significantly altered the events of Skokie. Skokie didn't have to respond to the Nazis' letter asking for a permit to demonstrate. And if the ACLU had taken a pass on Skokie, Collin would have been left in the lurch without the resources to take advantage of the legal system.
I believe that the other issue in this case is whether any man in this country has a right to a lawyer, and to suggest that we were wrong because perhaps the case would have gone away had we not represented him suggests there is no constitutional right to counsel. That too is bending the law.
Of course, if Skokie hadn't occurred, the reawakening of the survivors might not have happened. The new mantra was to remember and teach the history of the Holocaust. This was reflected in the groundbreaking miniseries entitled Holocaust that aired on NBC in 1978. Holocaust became the first graphic depiction of the horrors of the Holocaust on popular television.
Every Holocaust family that I knew of was glued to the TV watching that. That was something you did not miss. Remember, this is the day before VCRs and taping and that kind of thing. And they all watched it. This was a transformative event for these families and for America, because now it was okay to discuss this, to talk about what happened. Now America was starting to listen.
I went back to Dęblin, Poland. I was really frightened. I didn't know what it would do to my brain, but I was persuaded by my family to go back. And I saw some things that brought back all of these memories. These are the barracks. It was a terrible place, infested with lice, fleas, disease and everything, and some of it is still standing there. The cattle cars were absolutely miserable. We had 75 people to 100 in one, and there was no place to stand, to go to the washroom, no food. We were in it for 3 days.
There are Holocaust museums and memorials at other locations in the U.S., but in Skokie, it's not just about what happened in Europe, but what happened right here.
The attempt to march on Skokie in 1977, through a chain of occurrences from then to now, has led to the building of this museum, has led to the educating of thousands and thousands of young people from the Midwest, and frankly, all over the country, at this museum. So little did the Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis know what they had wrought in 1977, but that, you know, the flower blooms in place of the hate that they brought.
To my family, and I think to the other families as well, this was not a legal issue. It was a legal issue in the sense that it would be dragged out in the courts and in the media for 2 years, which only prolonged the torture for these survivors. But to them, this wasn't a legal issue at all. Why are Nazis being allowed to come to Skokie to get us? And when Frank Collin said that we're coming to get you, those were his exact words, they took that very literally.
There was nobody else in Chicago, who would have undertaken that defense. It was ACLU or nobody, and if nobody had stepped up, the First Amendment would have been damaged for all time.
It was a no-brainer. This was a classic case of a prior restraint and an unpopular speaker, and the First Amendment doesn't allow censorship of an unpopular speaker. So that there was no question in my mind as to what the right thing to do was.
What Frank Collin attempted to do was to scare and intimidate and invoke fear in this large survivor population in the heart of Skokie. All of this has happened because of one idiot who thought he could rankle and inflict harm and psychological damage upon this population. He miscalculated severely.
A sleepy community was rudely awakened, reminding residents of the suffering they tried to forget. It was a traumatic series of events, wherein free speech rights motivated the defense of hateful ranting and images. Ultimately, the Nazis did not make good on their Skokie threats. What remained was a community reawakened and more willing than ever to remember history and fight the evil that threatened to revisit them.
I hate Illinois Nazis.
So do I, John. And who doesn't?